Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Beyond the Headlines conversation. I'm Kim Conheiser-Freeman, Executive Director of the Women's Foreign Policy Group, which is a network of international affairs professionals dedicated to advancing women's leadership, amplifying their voices through substantive global issues programs, and preparing the next generation for leadership through mentoring. I'm delighted to welcome a very impressive panel for today's timely conversation on COVID-19's long shadow, national and global security challenges. Our speakers have a lot to cover, and I know that you all have questions as well. You can send them in to during the conversation using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and our moderator will include as many as she can. Today's conversation will be led by Jennifer Griffin, who has been covering these issues very closely. Jennifer has been Fox News' national security correspondent since 2007, before which she spent 15 years as a foreign correspondent. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Kim. And I want to take a moment and introduce our esteemed panel to our audience today. Samantha Vinograd is a national security analyst for CNN, a member of the Women's Foreign Policy Group board. She formerly served the NSC as the director for Iraq and senior advisor to the National Security Advisor. Carmen Medina is a 32-year veteran of the intelligence community and former CIA Deputy Director of Intelligence. Before retiring, she oversaw the CIA's Lessons Learned program and is co-author of Rebels at Work, a handbook for leading change from within. Karen Monaghan, also a retired intelligence community veteran, is now a principal of KJM Analytics. She served at the National Intelligence Council, where she published the unclassified report, SARS, Down But Still a Threat, and was also at the NIC during the global financial crisis. And Miyeon Oh is Director and Senior Fellow of the Asia Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council, Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. She has significant experience working in Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Welcome, panel. And I just wanted to say a few words and look back at the timeline of where we've been since late December in terms of this COVID crisis. If we look back, December 31st, China confirms the existence of a new virus. On January 21st, the first case is announced here in the US. A day later, the president says we have it under control. On January 29th, the White House task force was formed. On February 1st, and I think this is a fact that not many people know, the US military gave an execute order, an exord in their terms, to begin its pandemic operations plan, and it would be another 6 weeks before the president declares a national emergency on March 11th. That's about the same time that the WHO declares a pandemic. Today, we've learned that more than 70,000 Americans have died of the disease. 1 million plus have been infected, with those numbers rising. Yesterday, we heard from the White House that it planned to disband the task force. Now the focus has moved to great power competition and an attempt to control the narrative. The Wuhan lab virus origin story is gaining steam, and finger pointing about who knew what when is all beginning. So I'd like to ask the panel a broad question. I'd like an assessment from you as to US leadership during this time. What did the US do well? Is this the end of US global leadership? And has the US abdicated that role in exchange for American first policies? Sam, why don't we start with you?
Thanks so much. And what I would say is this has been a master class for the rest of the world in how not to do leadership, both in the run-up to and during a pandemic from a policy perspective. You know, Jennifer, as you mentioned, I served on the National Security Council, and I've seen how these kind of complex intelligence issues come to policymakers, how these crises are viewed by intelligence analysts, health experts, et cetera, and land on the NSC's desk. And what we've seen happen is kind of two main trends that are very disturbing and frankly being broadcast around the world. One is that intelligence to a large extent is only as useful as policymakers choose to make it. You can't lead a horse to water, or whatever that idiom is. And it appears that there was intelligence about the scale and the scope of this virus that policymakers did not choose to act on as efficiently as they could. That's trend number one. Lesson number two, or trend number two, is that management is really important. if you have a national security team or a task force or whatever this administration wants to call it, that is inefficient when it comes to doing all the tasks associated with crisis response, integrating intelligence, coordinating with allies, public messaging, which we're seeing a breakdown on right now when it comes to the origin story. If there is not a manager in place that's able to walk and chew gum, that's able to do all of these different, just very basic crisis management tasks, we see a breakdown. And that breakdown is being broadcast very publicly. And our enemies and our allies, global audiences, are really learning about vulnerabilities in the US national security apparatus, as well as vulnerabilities, of course, in US infrastructure and elsewhere. So if we are going to come out of this, whenever that's going to happen, and have any lessons learned, it's going to need to look at the management of the national security team during this period, with a very special focus on how intelligence was or was not integrated into the process.
Thank you, Sam. Carmen, I'll go to you next. And you've written the book on lessons learned in the intelligence community. What is your take, your assessment of US global leadership right now?
Thanks. And let me just say, I find myself in agreement with much of what, in fact, all of what Samantha said. And I think it's worthwhile. She mentioned both leadership and management. And it's interesting because in controlling the pandemic, probably what we most needed was very good management skills, humane, timely management skills. And I don't think even the defenders of the Trump administration would say that management has been one of its core strengths. In fact, it generally advocates less federal government role in most topics or subjects or issues. On the question of intelligence, absolutely correct that every policymaker has the right to ignore intelligence that they don't agree with, because often intelligence is dealing with rather murky things. What I find difficult to comprehend is how what was going on first in China, then in Iran, then in Italy, obviously Korea, most of Asia, was ignored. These were not subjective issues, these were objective facts. And the fact that we didn't really even have screening on almost all international flights is just an abject failure. And finally, I just want to make a comment on the question of US leadership and whether this is a mortal wound. I think it depends upon how long the pandemic lasts. And right now, it looks like it's going to last a long time, which means that the US will suffer from it a long time. And I think that will have very practical implications for US leadership. So for example, our military readiness will suffer. Our ability to deploy aircraft carriers, which are the platform for the projection of US power, is very much in question right now. So there's a real diminution of the US ability to project power. And finally, I think that if the pandemic lasts a long time, what will happen is that regions will begin to recover. So we already see Australia and New Zealand forming a bloc, and it would make sense for Australia and New Zealand to cooperate more closely with Asia during this period. And as these regional blocs form, the EU is forming its own bloc to sponsor research on the vaccine. As these regional blocs form and the US doesn't participate in them, and if this lasts for some time, I can see it having a very measurable impact on US influence in the world.
Thank you, Carmen. Miyeon, I'd like to ask you, is this the end of US global leadership? What did the US do wrong in these last few months? How did it abdicate as a global leader?
Thank you, Jennifer. I don't think this is the end of US leadership, but I think it's fair to say that US has largely failed, at least so far, to provide strong leadership for a coordinated and effective global response to COVID-19 pandemic crisis. This has created a leadership vacuum for China try to fill, and we've seen that China is moving quickly to position itself as a global leader for pandemic response, while the US is struggling its effort to battle the virus at home. For instance, China is providing more coronavirus-related aid to Southeast Asia and other parts of the region than the United States, and shaping the diplomatic narrative of itself as a responsible global stakeholder in this crisis. So some opinion leaders warn that this coronavirus could reshape the global order and change the context of US-China strategic competition. While I agree with this argument, I think it's also important to note that any major geopolitical and economic changes are not solely due to COVID-19, but also driven by pre-existing setting due to US-China strategic competition, trade war, and potential decoupling. So I think rather than fixating on the origins of the virus and China's initial response of mishandling to the virus, the United States should focus on working with allies and partners to lead a global collaborative effort to overcome the pandemic crisis, increase the global resilience, and minimize its economic impact, and safeguard values and principles of the rules-based international system.
Thank you. Karen, I'd just like to ask you, did the US do anything right as a global leader during this time? And then have you react to what the other panelists have said.
Sadly, I can't identify anything that the United States did right during this. And I think what has happened is that COVID-19 just amplified tendencies that were already present, particularly the America First, and abdicated a global leadership role. There had already been a stain on US leadership in 2003 with the Iraq War, in 2008 with the global financial crisis, which emanated from the United States. But in both cases, we regained a bit of our leadership because we stepped up to the plate and urged the global community to cooperate. In 2008 in particular, we brought the G20 together. We got the G20 to agree that there was trade protectionism and other protectionist policies. What I fear most is in the aftermath of COVID-19, especially as different regions begin to quickly, that there will be a tendency, perhaps led by the United States, to implement all kinds of protectionist measures. We've already been accused of trying to seize valuable PPE, diverting deliveries from other countries to the United States. And protectionism is contagious. And so if we or others start to go in that direction, there's no telling how deep and wide it will become. And what really worries me is, going forward, the kind of national security crises increasingly that the United States and the world is going to face are the very ones that do not adhere to borders. Pandemics, climate change, cyber warfare, they're the very threats that can only be handled when we work together. And if this is sort of a harbinger of what's to come, it's very concerning.
Thank you. Sam, I want to go back to you. Can you give any examples of something that the US did right? And then I'd like to ask you, was this an intelligence failure? If so, why?
Well, on something that the US government did right, I do think it's worth noting that the US State Department did really unprecedented work to bring tens of thousands of American citizens back home. I don't think that in the history of the State Department we have ever seen an effort like that. And there were problems and there's still difficulty bringing some folks home, but I think some credit is due to all of the folks that were involved in that effort around the world. That was really a massive undertaking. In terms of, was this an intelligence failure? The short answer is, we don't yet know. We have seen open source reporting from the Washington Post, CNN, and others about warnings that were reportedly contained in intelligence assessments. But we haven't seen those intelligence assessments, so I can't really speak to that. It does appear that the intelligence community did do their job, which was to provide unbiased assessments about the virus, the fact that it was coming and the scale of what it was going to look like. That's one intelligence question. The second intelligence question, of course, is where did it originate? It appears that work is still underway. But to Carmen's point, this is an intelligence question to a certain degree, but there was so much open source information about this virus as well that relying just on intelligence didn't have to be necessary. This wasn't a terrorist attack. We weren't trying to find some, rogue terrorist cell that was going to launch a massive attack. So this was, back to my original point, this was a question of intelligence. It was a question of integrating open source information. It was a question of talking to allies and even rivals. So I think that this was a failure of management and leadership more than it was a failure of intelligence. And what the world has really learned from all of this as well is just how easy it is to stoke mass panic in the United States, to stoke these divisions by really, really, honing in on this vulnerability, which is a lack of management at the most senior levels. And last point, you look at something like the information war that's going on right now. The disinformation campaigns by Russia, China, and Iran are massive, perhaps unprecedented, and really global at this point. So we have, the State Department, DHS, and others working to combat that disinformation. And then on the other hand, we have the president using language that the disinformation campaigns may be integrating. So the right hand's not talking to the left hand on so many of these issues. So that's why I think this is more of a management failure than an intelligence one.
Thank you. Carmen, I'd like to go to you and have you respond to that, but also to ask you, during your IC career, what was the biggest mistake you made? What mistakes might the IC be making right now in terms of how it's approaching China and the pandemic and the reporting on that? And the pandemic?
Will just to first address the issue of narrative. I think we're at a real, the US is at a real disadvantage on the question of narrative because our own internal narrative is so, we stand out for the strength of the, it's a hoax, or social distancing is a bad idea. You can't trust experts. I don't know about you all, but my Facebook page is full of old high school friends saying really the most outrageous things about what's going on. So China and Russia both sort of enforce a narrative upon their people, but that does give them an advantage as they broadcast their story to the rest of the world. In terms of intelligence failures that I've had and intelligence mistakes, I think the thing that I most got wrong was in the 1990s when I just could not imagine how Yugoslavia would break up. And that goes way back in the time machine. And I think that was a bias that I had. And a bias you see during this crisis, I had the bias of optimism and expecting that the worst case would not happen. And that is a bias that's a nonpartisan bias. It affects all policymakers. When you as an intelligence analyst tell them, if we invade Iraq, we might face a civil war there, and the policymaker says, really? And we go, yes, it's a worst case scenario. At that moment, the policymaker is actually also hearing it's not gonna happen. And I think that's a very common pattern for intelligence mistakes. But I would agree first and foremost with Samantha and her point that given the amount of information that was out there, this was a mistake of the policy process and sense making, not a mistake of intelligence.
Thank you. Miyeon, in terms of following up on that issue of propaganda, who, from your point of view, is winning the propaganda war, China or the US right now?
I think it's too early to determine who's winning because it's a long conversation. And but I like I said, unless US is actively collecting the global response and taking the strong leadership, it's likely to create a leadership vacuum for China again. And here I like to talk about the US-China strategic competition a little more, and decoupling, and how it shaped global and regional response to COVID-19 and will likely shape the post-coronavirus world. And I believe that I'm in a pretty good position to bring in views and responses from Asia, and really think about the region heavily relying on China economically and dealing with the dilemma of whether they can make a choice between China and the United States. And I want to focus on how Asian countries are reacting to supply chain disruptions due to COVID-19 to minimize its economic impact, as I see a couple of important observations that have policy implications to U.S. national security. And I also like to reinforce what Karen said in terms of the trade protectionist policy and measures. So the first observation that I saw is countries such as India, Vietnam, and Malaysia are likely benefiting from US-China trade war, as major economies want to move their production lines out of China to reduce their dependence on China and diversify their supply chains. The COVID-19 outbreaks, I think, seem to halt or delay such move, but not likely to change their long-term plan or strategy for diversification. The second observation is the countries that I see whose economies are hit hard by disruptions caused by COVID-19, and they're dealing with the two counter arguments. One argument is that COVID-19 validates the claim that over-reliance on any single country for supply chains is a strategic mistake. And therefore, some of Chinese neighboring countries and their companies are considering moving their production lines to other countries, such as Southeast Asia and other parts of the world, to diversify their supply chains. We could name a Japanese company, Mazda. They recently announced to invest $5 million to move their production line to Mexico. And also Taiwan is a very good example of doing that move. But the counter argument that I see is the companies that were trying to reduce their heavy reliance on China cannot help but reverse their move back to China to keep their supply chains open and operating, as it is critical for countries like South Korea and also Japan, whose major industries are seriously hit by the coronavirus pandemic, and to promote recovery in their key industries as their financial markets continue to reel. Also, we'll likely see number of firms decide that they would rather seek short-term stability via reconnecting to existing Chinese supply chains than rather pay huge upfront costs, capital costs, to hedge against the next global crisis. Apparently, as China is trying to return to business as usual, Chinese authorities are offering diplomatic and even economic incentive to restore and boost its investment and with its neighboring countries. And one example would be in April, China allowed the entry of around 200 Samsung electronic engineers into the country and making an exception to its ban of foreigners to enter their border during the pandemic to work on the expansion of their semiconductor plant in Xi'an. So I think on this both argument, I find still that COVID-19 is not the original source of new consideration or effort to diversify their supply chains away from China, and US-China trade war shape pre-existing dynamics. And then the third observation is a localization trend to take overseas investment back to home country has started due to the US-China trade war. And this COVID-19 COVID-19 accelerated this trend. So what I want to say briefly that it's really interesting and very would have a huge policy implication to U.S. national security. Each country how each country is going to take which avenue and in terms of all these choices.
Thank you, Miyeon. Karen, I'd like to ask you and Carmen, one of the biggest shifts in narrative, as we've pointed out, is the discussion now of the virus origin story. As intelligence experts, how does it strike you that suddenly you have the Secretary of State saying that they have high confidence that the virus escaped from the Wuhan lab? What alarm bells go off to you? What is your assessment of why this narrative is suddenly increasingly popular?
Well, I think it's gaining resonance because there's an effort to point fingers and to shift blame away from the United States and our inability to handle this. You know, I think one of the lessons that was not learned after 9/11 was the need to build resilience in the United States. We focused most of our attention on counterterrorism, fighting over there so we wouldn't have to fight them here. We learned a lesson in 2006 with Katrina, what it means not to have resilience. New York and New Jersey learned that lesson after Sandy. Maybe now's the time we're going to learn the lesson in the United States that resilience needs to be built up nationally. That and maybe there's also to understand that there should be a broader definition of national security. You know, health and welfare of the American people should be primary, and that's not just about fighting wars or invisible enemies. That's building the capacity to withstand, whether they be national security threats or natural hazards. And I think we're going to have to sort of turn our attention to that. Just want to make a brief comment on whether this was a leadership failure or an intelligence failure. I think it was really more a bureaucratic failure. And one of the things that's similar to the mis and disinformation campaign of 2016, the 2008 national global financial crisis that emanated from the United States, is really none of the intelligence agencies, and that includes DHS, really focuses on weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the United States. They tend to think about a threat from the outside. And therefore, we might provide intelligence of what's happening over there and potentially what the risks are to the United States, but we never really focus on those risks and how those scenarios may play out. We missed it in 2016 in the run-up to the elections, and we certainly missed it here.
Thank you. Carmen, do you want to comment?
Yes, so I particularly appreciate Karen's comment that this is a bureaucratic failure. We like to make fun of bureaucracies, but every once in a while we actually need a functioning bureaucracy to deal with a significant problem. And we know particulars, for example, that CDC actually had overseas individuals assigned overseas in China, for example, to monitor health developments, and they were withdrawn, I guess, in the 2018-2019 timeframe. I think on the question about the examples of the Wuhan lab, those stories were floating around in mid-January. I know that I was following the development of this virus very carefully, and I read those accounts. And until, if, when, perhaps never, China allows an independent examination of everything that is now knowable in terms of the facts on the ground at the time that the virus came out. And the reason why I'm saying it this way is so much of it may never really be knowable, given that we would have to deal with China. I think that it's easy for different members of the administration to cherry pick a fact or a mystery about the virus and use it to advance whatever partisan issue or political issue that they want to advance. And certainly making China the enemy, sort of personifying the threat within Chinese society, is something that would appeal to the American electorate in a way that this borderless, invisible enemy does not. And sadly, that's the case.
Carmen, just to follow up, the fact that you saw some of these lab theories back in early January, and now it's sort of entered mainstream and the bloodstream, does it suggest to you that it's being amplified through disinformation campaigns from other countries, the way we saw Russia amplify certain messaging at a certain time? There's just something a little suspicious about how it gained such steam at this point in time. And there's still division between the State Department and NSC are pushing that line, but the CIA and the Defense Department are agnostic about it.
Right. I mean, I remember very clearly the reports that suggested it might have been an accident at a lab. They came out in mid-January. They were one of these pre-publication documents. The authors were Chinese doctors or researchers. I'm not exactly sure where they were based. It was withdrawn within a few days, so I don't even know if that reporting exists anymore. Certainly, it seemed credible at the time. I'm not saying that it was correct. It was like, worth considering. And obviously, some people have now begun to amplify that theory. I don't know whether or not they have some new evidence that they're basing this amplification on, but certainly, particularly just this one last detail, the report was withdrawn, and we suspect that the hand of the Chinese government was involved in the withdrawal of the report from the pre-publication site. The Chinese are clearly very nervous about that kind of story getting out. Now, there's any number of reasons why they could be nervous. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's true, but even the suspicion that this happened is such a stain on their reputation, I don't think they could tolerate it.
Thank you. And Sam, what are some more of the longer term implications? And if I could get you and others to react to the notion that 30 countries now have smartphone apps that they're going to track their civilians with data regarding whether they're infected with the virus. Is that something that's going to fly in the US? Is it something that you think is needed? And do we need to get over our concern for civil liberties on that issue?
On the technology question, I've seen those reports and am deeply glad that the tech sector is stepping up to work with government. I saw earlier that my friend Eric Schmidt will be working with Governor Cuomo, for example, to bring tech solutions to New York State. That's really positive. I have to tell you, as a former government official who spent a lot of time on surveillance issues, that kind of stuff makes me a little bit nervous. But I'll leave that to my other colleagues to answer a bit more. On the longer term lessons, I think we have to look at this and broaden the aperture a little bit. Think about how many resources have been devoted to the coronavirus response, just in, let's say, the last month. Think about how many resources, both physical, financial, and just people, have not done their originally assigned mission set, whether they've been grounded because they can't travel, whether they're not allowed to leave their embassy because it's dangerous to engage with counterparts, whether funds have been reallocated from initial programs to coronavirus response. Recovering from coronavirus may take a generation because of all the things that we weren't able to do during this period. The US government adopted urgent and necessary measures, for example, to ground troops, to stop training at key military centers because it just wasn't safe to do that. Urgent and necessary, sure, but it's not like North Korea stopped producing nuclear weapons, or ISIS stopped planning more attacks, or climate change went away. It did slow down. So my point is that whenever we do mitigate the virus, one of the most important things is going to be, and this is honestly a policy statement, not a political one, is going to be having a leader who's willing to instruct his team and say, hey guys, we need to do an audit of everything we didn't do during this period. we need to be honest about how exposed we are. And last point, I spent a lot of time working with UNICEF, the IRC, and CARE, and talking about just the humanitarian impact of the coronavirus, the fact that this has exacerbated so many underlying crises like food insecurity, gender-based violence, communicable diseases, because funds were reallocated, resources were reallocated to the COVID response. So the longer-term impact on national security has not everything to do with COVID-19, and a lot more to do with everything we were not able to implement during this period.
Thank you. And it's very interesting. The military, the U.S. Defense Department, has already sent military archivists out to gather lessons learned from all the cities in the U.S., which is an ongoing project, but it is fascinating that they already realize they have to look back at lessons learned from this period. Karen, you have written so much about, you wrote about SARS, you've warned about pandemics for such a long time. Are pandemics the new normal? And what did we miss that we should have known because of SARS?
I don't know if pandemics are the new normal. I would say, consistently in the intelligence community since the late 90s, when the first intelligence estimate was written about the risk of infectious disease, we've warned that, it's not a matter of if, but when. And certainly as there's an increasing move into out of urban areas into rural areas, exposing populations to animals, there's a higher risk of zoonotic diseases jumping from an animal to a person, and then person-to-person transmission. When we warned about it in 2003, SARS was in remission. But we said it was down, but it was still a threat. And we laid out 3 scenarios for how it could come back. We also warned about the lack of healthcare facilities and health and products, ventilators. We warned all about that back in 2003. As I said to somebody else I was talking to about this, however, 2003 was also when we invaded Iraq. So as long as SARS was down, people didn't really pay attention. And our memories are fleeting, and even though the intelligence community continued to warn, because it didn't happen, it was perceived as not a threat. And diseases like Ebola and others were over there, not over here. And even after H1N1, which killed tens of thousands of people in the United States, it just didn't resonate. I just wanted to add something about what Sam commented about the longer term effects. We haven't even really talked about the global economic recovery and what that's going to take. And when you think about Europe, which was already having economic problems, when you think about China, which was already slowing down, not to mention the continent of Africa, which was already facing a pretty severe slowdown in economic growth, largely due to the slowdown in China, largely due to the fall in commodity prices. Then you lay on COVID, although initially they seem to have dodged a bit of a bullet, but I think it's too early to tell. I mean, I think there are long implications. And if the global recovery, economic recovery is slow, or if it's W-shaped, this certainly will take at least a generation to recover from.
Miyeon, I'd like to ask your assessment. What would be the impact if the U.S. actually asks for or demands compensation from China for the COVID outbreak? Is that realistic? Is that just a populist message from the Trump administration, or could you see that happening, and what would be China's response?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I was going to hit that point, and I would like to echo what everyone said. And we're talking about whether this is intelligence failure, leadership failure, or bureaucratic failure. And like Sam said, how many resources and energy we're investing and we're committed to combating this coronavirus, and what is the long-term implications, like Karen just said. And if we call it as US compensation from China, or we call it as a punishment, for instance, we heard a couple of times, more than a couple of times, that President Trump said that he actually might put more tariff on top of the up to 25% tariff on $370 billion that is in place in Chinese goods currently. And I think it is really hard to get support from US allies and partners, even from the region. And if we are and have spent so much time and resources already, and what is going to be US priority, I think it's a question that we should consider. And we just heard yesterday or a couple of days before that the US government is now turbocharging the initiative, so-called the Economic Prosperity Network, to remove global supply chain from China. And I think US government sees this as an opportunity and as an opportunity to, which I mean that they tend to see this current crisis as a perfect storm that demonstrates a clear strategic risk of over-reliance on China. But if US government is it's really trying to restructure the global supply chains. And it's such a long-term project. But so whether US is going to make a choice between putting a lot of effort to find out the scientific evidence in terms of the origins of the virus, or whether US is going to allocate more resources to work with allies and partners, and to provide very clear guidelines and the necessary next step. And clearly there's a strong need for region in the Pacific and Asian countries for strong US leadership, because those countries are the ones have been struggling because of the US-China trade war, but the Chinese economic standards and really things that were not played as equitable to what US has been provided so far. So I think it is a very important momentum for US to show the strong leadership.
Thank you, Miyeon. I'm cognizant of the time, and so I just want to ask each of the panelists to give an example of leadership from other countries that has been effective in terms of battling COVID, something that the US could learn from, some concrete examples if you could choose different ones. And what is the impact on women leaders in the days ahead, since we've heard such many examples of countries with women leaders doing well during this pandemic. I'll start with you, Carmen.
So not only is there a correlation between handling the pandemic well and being a woman, there's also a correlation between being scientific and handling the pandemic well. So Ursula Merkel, for example, I think her background is as a chemist. And I think that a mistake that the US made early on was that the issue somehow, inexplicably in my view, became political and partisan. You know, even today, whether or not you wear a mask apparently is a Democratic or Republican issue. And I think countries, a key thing that was done well is to put the scientists out front on the issue before the politicians, and to prevent it as best as you can from it being a partisan issue. Because really, when public health becomes a partisan issue, you really have a breakdown in how to handle it.
Great. Karen, can you follow up on examples of other countries doing something well that we could learn from, and the role of women leaders?
Well, I certainly think Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, she cracked down and quickly, pretty severely. But I think what she also did was incredibly transparent communications. articulating why she was doing what she was doing. And in a crisis situation, crisis communications are paramount. And you need to make sure that all members of your government, if they're speaking in, are using the same narrative. And I think that was a perfect example. And as a female leader, certainly Singapore doesn't have female leadership, but they also did an excellent job. And I think part of the reason is because they learned from 2003 in the SARS situation, and they began to build the kind of resiliency in their healthcare system, the surveillance systems, all the things that we now will need to be doing in the United States. They all had that in play. They had the playbook, and they didn't just dust it off. They've been working it since then. So I think those are two lessons that the United States can learn.
Great. Sam?
Well, I plan to move to New Zealand if all hell breaks loose here. One, because of the Prime Minister's coherent response, willingness to take measures that were necessary but may have been politically uncomfortable, and because it's really good weather there and looks beautiful. So I'm with Karen on that one. I would also point to some non-female leaders, in parts of Europe, the willingness to really implement strict lockdowns and define people who broke those regulations may mean, and again, we have to get some distance from this to see where the virus reappears and how things reemerge or may reemerge. But the willingness to do that, while very difficult for the population, may actually allow countries in Europe to reopen sooner and safer. So I think that's something to point to. And last point on what Karen was saying, I do think we have to call out the elephant in the room for a second when it comes to communications, because one of the biggest issues during this crisis was not really knowing what or who to believe. That is a function of incoherent and uncoordinated messaging from the administration, which is they shot themselves in the foot when it came to trying to get a narrative together on what was happening. And the science, everything from the drink bleach moment to the drugs that were still being tested. There wasn't a coordinated narrative, which is one of the worst things you can do during a crisis. And unfortunately, the president's track record of lying catches up with him in a moment like this. I don't think that people really knew what to believe and when to believe it, and so started going to other sources of information than the administration. Fortunately, governors stepped in. I think Governor Cuomo, Governor Newsom, Governor Murphy, they established themselves as reliable voices. But from a policy perspective, not trusting what's coming from the podium during a crisis like this is one of the most dangerous scenarios that I can think of. And it didn't start with this crisis, but certainly came to light during it.
Thank you. And Miyeon, if you could respond to an example of a leader who did something that the U.S. could learn from during this crisis and the role of female leaders, please.
So I'd like to share that the head of CDC of South Korea, she is female, and one of the successful factor is really effective messaging. And sometimes I think, especially when we're dealing with this kind of crisis and crisis of uncertainty, it's really important to do effective messaging and send a clear and clear message. For instance, in the United States, I have observed that when to wear a facial mask and whom to wear a facial mask. So always better to have clear messages and in terms of transparency and trust, and technology was also one important factor, but try to really explain clearly. That was the part of effective messaging. And there was a debate at the beginning whether she should hold the daily conference, but she should be the one, or whether the President Moon of South Korea. But President Moon, she said that that's her area of expertise, so she should handle. So she was the one who was holding the daily conference. And I think that really worked out well. So the one lesson learned is effective message, and especially if the US government is trying to hold China accountable for any future high-risk behaviors, such as disinformation and censorship. I think it's very important.
And we have time for a couple of there have been some great questions that have come in. One is about the WHO, and I'd like to ask the panelists whether the WHO can be saved, and does the Trump administration have a point that the Chinese influence over the WHO has been a problem during this pandemic? Can you fix the WHO, or do you have to jettison it? Let's start with Karen.
Oh, you know, the WHO, just like the United Nations, it's a product of its membership. It doesn't have any coercive power to make countries do anything. There was criticism of the WHO in 2000, and it strengthened. It became a more transparent and more effective organization in that. But it's only as strong and only going to be as good as the members and the members that give support. I do think it is a concern that countries like Taiwan, for example, are restricted in terms of their participation in the WHO, especially when you have a disease that there's an outbreak in Asia. Not having the data from Taiwan, not having their input is damaging. But I certainly think it can be fixed, but it only can be fixed if the global community is willing to give it the support that it needs.
And Sam, there's a question that came in for you about, let's see, let me have it here. Looking at cities like New York City, will they be able to go back to pre-COVID standards for gatherings, business as usual, overcrowding on subways, parks? Will cities like New York City, LA, San Francisco be able to go back to normal? Maybe you can look, and maybe we can ask Miyeon Oh to look at cities in Asia. Did they go back to normal after SARS, et cetera?
Well, in the first instance, or to be honest, we just don't know. I think what we are seeing the mayors of these cities do and the governors of these states do is very wisely engage in phased reopening and phased lifting of these guidelines. But we have to keep one thing in mind about these cities. You know, I live in the West Village and it's wonderful. You can go walk outside and, you know, stroll along the river, and there's the option to social distance. In parts of New York City and LA and other high density urban centers throughout the country, that is less of an option. And so regardless of how this phased reopening happens and whether we ever get back, quote unquote, to normal, there are still going to be high risk places within the city, and that's worrisome. The last part of it just comes down to kind of personal responsibility a little bit. You know, there is going to be a response from mayors and governors, sure, but then there's also individual decisions that we're all going to have to make. And whether, you know, I live in New York City, whether I feel comfortable going on the subway when it is or isn't open, and whether I choose to wear a mask or wear gloves or what have you. I think a lot of it is going to come down to that. And it's a question of whether just as individuals, we choose to change our social habits at all. Is something I think that it will be an interesting social experiment to see. I have a feeling that most people will jump back into, you know, the quote unquote normal because they so yearn that normalcy. But then from my perspective, just I'm still worried and still waiting to see what the science says about a first wave, second wave, et cetera. So that's a long way of saying I don't think we know, when it comes down to a mix of official response and individual.
And Miyeon, very quickly, Asian cities are very highly populated. What are lessons we could learn from those cities about how New York and LA and others can go back to normal?
So there are countries, a couple of cities, they're easing social distancing and trying to go back to normal. But I would say that maybe new normal, because I think this pandemic crisis would actually change. I mean, I think it's very likely to change the paradigms and norms that govern our daily life. So I think, for instance, even if we think that we are able to control this pandemic and coronavirus, I think still it's likely for us to do more convening things virtually like we do today. And in terms of public health and sanity, I think there will be change of lifestyle.
And Carmen, I'll give you the last word. In terms of disinformation and the campaign, the presidential campaign here in the US, how will Russia and China take advantage of this particular moment in time in US politics? And is there anything the US can do to protect itself from the kind of on the 26th?
I think the motivations of Russia and China are different. I think the motivation of Russia is to delegitimize the American political system in the eyes of the American people and of the world. And I think the motivation of China is more about protecting China. I think that particularly if the election process in November is uneven, i.e. the pandemic is still ongoing and people's ability to vote will be difficult, I think that the Russians will emphasize a campaign of this was not a legitimate election, it was hacked, it was, you know, a failure of democracy to protect ourselves. I think, you know, elections are run by each state, and I think people have to use the method that they think best ensures for a fair election, I think, and a safe one. And I think right now that's election by mail, although I worry that, you know, if it's the first time we're using it, it will just open us up to charges that it's not a legitimate election. I think that would be truly horrible.
Right. Thank you.
Well, I would just to say, in terms of the disinformation, what I fear is that American politicians pile on to any disinformation campaign that this is not a legitimate election. We heard a little bit about that in 2016, and what will make it truly horrible is if US politicians, because of the pandemic, also declare that this was not free and fair because so many were unable, so many of their supporters, whoever they are, were unable to vote and vote in safety.
Well, we've come to the end of our session, and I want to hand it back to Kim, but I want to thank our wonderful panel today for this great discussion, and thank you for sending in questions. This has been a great hour. Thank you very much. Kim?
And I'm just adding my thanks. Please join me from your living rooms or wherever you are with a big round of applause. We won't hear you, but we'll feel the sentiment. And thank you for your excellent questions as well. We hope that you'll stay connected with us. Join us as a member if you aren't already, and that we'll see you at one of our upcoming programs, either virtually or hopefully in person one day soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.